The growl came from the far corner of the room, low and steady, like an engine that never stopped running. Daniel Reyes stood frozen at the doorway of the guest room he had cleared out only that morning, staring at the massive dog crouched beside the overturned bed frame. Wood splinters covered the floor. The curtains hung in shreds from the window, and in the middle of the wreckage sat a dog easily twice the size Daniel had expected. His fur matted, his eyes wide and wild, his lips pulled back just enough to show teeth. "Bruno," Daniel said quietly, testing the name for the first time out loud. The dog's ears flattened. He backed further into the corner, knocking over a lamp that shattered against the hardwood floor. Daniel did not move. He had buried his brother only 12 days earlier, and now he stood in his own house, holding a leash that led to nothing but chaos, wondering what exactly he had agreed to. His brother, Patrick, had spent the last 6 years of his life running a small wildlife rescue 2 hours north of the city. He took in animals nobody else wanted, injured hawks, orphaned foxes, and, 3 months before the accident that took his life, a dog that had been found tied to a fence post on the edge of a construction site, starved and beaten so badly that the local vet said it was a miracle he had survived at all. Patrick had named him Bruno and spent every evening after work sitting with him, never rushing him, never forcing him. In his last letter to Daniel, written only a week before he died, Patrick had written one line that Daniel could not get out of his head. "Bruno just needs someone patient enough to wait him out. Don't give up on him too fast." Daniel had read that letter after the funeral, sitting alone in his brother's empty cabin, and something in him had refused to let the dog go to a shelter. Guilt, maybe. Grief, more likely. He told himself it was the last piece of Patrick he had left, and he was not ready to let it go. Now, standing in the doorway with the dog snarling at him from the wreckage of a guest room, Daniel understood how foolish that decision might have been. "Sir, please, step back." The voice belonged to Oliver, the estate's longtime groundskeeper, who had followed Daniel down the hallway with a broom in his hand, as though that might somehow help. "That animal isn't safe. Look what he did to the room in 1 hour." "He's scared," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "Scared animals bite," Oliver said. "I've worked around dogs my whole life, and that one there, sir, that one's not right. Something happened to him. Something bad." Daniel didn't answer. He simply closed the door, slow and careful, and stood in the hallway listening to Bruno's claws scraping against the floor inside, back and forth, like a caged animal trying to find a way out that did not exist. By the end of that first day, 3 members of the household staff had refused to go anywhere near the East Wing. The cook, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret who had worked for Daniel's family for over a decade, told him plainly at dinner that she would quit before she brought food anywhere close to that room again. Daniel didn't blame her. He had heard the crash of something else breaking only an hour before, and when he'd gone to check, he'd found Bruno standing over the remains of a wooden chair, breathing hard, eyes darting toward the door the moment it opened. "We should call the shelter," Oliver said, not for the first time. "Let people who know what they're doing handle this." "He's already been through a shelter," Daniel said. "That's where half of this comes from. My brother pulled him out of one that was going to put him down within the week. I'm not sending him back to that." "Then hire someone who actually knows dogs like this, because none of us do, sir. And honestly, none of us should have to." Daniel didn't answer. He walked the length of the hallway that night after the house had gone quiet, and stopped outside the guest room door, listening. No growling, no crashing, just a low, broken whimper, quiet enough that Daniel had to hold his breath to hear it. It sounded less like an animal defending its territory, and more like something that had given up expecting anyone to come. He thought about knocking, which felt absurd the moment the thought crossed his mind. He thought about opening the door and simply sitting with the dog the way his brother apparently had, but he remembered the teeth, the wild eyes, the way Bruno's whole body had gone rigid the instant Daniel stepped into the room, and he stayed exactly where he was, hand resting flat against the door, not turning the handle. "I don't know how to do this," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the dog on the other side of the wood. "I don't even know how to do half the things I'm supposed to do without you here, Patrick." There was no answer, of course, only the faint whimper, and then silence. The next morning, Daniel called a professional trainer recommended by a colleague, a man named Victor, who had built a reputation working with aggressive rescue dogs for nearly 20 years. Victor arrived within 2 days, confident and businesslike, carrying a bag of tools Daniel didn't recognize, and a leash thick enough to hold something far larger than Bruno. "Let's see what we're working with," Victor said, walking toward the guest room with the easy stride of someone who had done this 100 times before. Daniel followed him down the hallway, feeling a small flicker of hope for the first time since the funeral. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe all Bruno needed was someone who actually understood dogs, someone with training and technique, someone who wasn't fumbling through grief and guesswork the way Daniel had been. Victor opened the door with practiced confidence. The sound that followed was unlike anything Daniel had heard from Bruno before. A deep, rolling growl that seemed to come from somewhere far larger than the dog's actual body. Victor stepped back instinctively, his hand tightening around the leash he hadn't even managed to attach yet. "Easy," Victor said, his voice calm but his shoulders tense. "Easy, boy." Bruno lunged toward the doorway, not quite reaching them, but close enough that Victor slammed the door shut on instinct, breathing hard, color draining slightly from his face. "That's not a dog with a training problem," Victor said, straightening his jacket, trying to recover his composure. "That's a dog that's been through something severe. I've seen this before. Some of them you can bring back, some of them you can't. I'm not sure which one this is yet, but I'll tell you honestly, Mr. Reyes, this could take months, and there's no guarantee at the end of it." "But you'll try?" Daniel asked. Victor hesitated, glancing back at the closed door. "I'll come back next week. Let's see how he does with distance work first, before anyone tries getting close again." Daniel nodded, though the hesitation in Victor's voice sat heavy in his chest the rest of that day. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that hiring someone with real expertise would fix things quickly, that within a few sessions Bruno would settle, and the house would return to whatever version of normal it had known, before grief and guilt brought a wild, wounded animal into its halls. Instead, the following week brought only more of the same. Victor returned twice more, each time approaching a little differently, each time retreating a little faster. By the third visit, he sat Daniel down in the study and spoke plainly. "I've worked with difficult dogs for a long time," Victor said, "but I've never met one who shuts down and lashes out in equal measure the way this one does. Most dogs, you can read them, predict them. This one, I genuinely cannot get a read on. My honest advice, and I don't say this lightly, is that you consider a facility that specializes in cases this severe. I don't think there's much more I can offer here." Daniel sat quietly for a long moment after Victor left, staring at the empty chair across from him, thinking of his brother's letter again. Don't give up on him too fast. But how long was too fast supposed to last, when every attempt seemed to end the same way, with fear on both sides and nothing gained? Word of the trouble in the East Wing spread quickly through the household staff, as these things always did. By the following week, 2 more part-time workers had quietly asked to be reassigned to other duties, citing the dog as the reason, without needing to explain further. The house, once quiet and orderly, now carried a tension that seemed to hum through every hallway, every conversation, every glance toward the closed guest room door. Daniel found himself avoiding that end of the house entirely during the day, only returning late at night to stand outside the door and listen, the way he had that first evening. Sometimes he heard nothing at all. Sometimes he heard the same low whimper, quiet and exhausted, the sound of something that had stopped expecting comfort from anyone. He began to wonder, in his more honest moments, whether Oliver had been right from the start, whether some things truly could not be fixed with patience or good intentions, whether the kindest thing left to do was admit defeat and find Bruno somewhere else to go, some facility built to handle dogs too far gone for an ordinary household to manage. But every time that thought surfaced, his brother's voice came with it, steady and certain even in memory, patient enough to wait him out. Daniel did not have an answer yet for how long that patience was supposed to last, or what it would take to reach a dog that seemed determined to keep everyone and everything as far away as possible. All he knew, standing outside that door night after night, was that giving up did not feel like an option he could live with. Not yet. Not while there was still a whimper on the other side of the door, instead of silence. What he did not know, as he turned away from the guest room that night and walked back down the darkened hallway toward his own room, was that the answer to Bruno's fear was not going to come from an expert with a leash, or from Daniel's own trial and error. It was going to come from someone who had not even been hired yet, someone whose name Daniel did not know, someone who would walk into that guest room in just a few days and do something no one else in the house had thought to try at all. She would simply sit down on the floor and say nothing. The staffing agency called on a Tuesday morning, apologizing before Daniel had even finished picking up the phone. "We're sorry, Mr. Reyes, but we've had another cancellation. The housekeeper we sent last week has asked not to be scheduled at your residence again." Daniel rubbed his forehead, standing in the kitchen where Margaret was quietly preparing lunch, careful to keep her eyes on the counter rather than on him. This was the fourth call of its kind in as many weeks. Word had clearly spread through every agency in the area that the Reyes estate came with a warning attached. A large, unpredictable dog that no one wanted to work anywhere near. "I understand," Daniel said, though frustration crept into his voice, despite his effort to keep it steady. "Do you have anyone else you could send? Anyone at all?" There was a pause on the line, the kind that told Daniel the answer before it was spoken. "We do have one candidate who just registered with us this week. A single mother, very reliable references from her previous employer. But Mr. Reyes, I do want to be transparent. She has not been told about the circumstances with the dog. I didn't want to lose another candidate before she'd even started." "Send her," Daniel said. "I'll explain everything myself, in person, before she starts any work in that part of the house." He hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, staring out the window toward the east wing, where Bruno's room sat silent, at least for the moment. It had been 3 days since Victor's last visit, 3 days since the trainer had gently suggested, once again, that perhaps some dogs simply could not be reached. Daniel had not called Victor back. He told himself it was because he needed time to think, but the truth, if he was honest, was closer to something else. He was afraid that if he called and asked Victor to try one more time, the answer would be the kind of quiet, professional refusal that closed a door for good. Meanwhile, Bruno's condition seemed to worsen, rather than improve. He had stopped eating the food left for him outside his door 2 nights running, the bowl sitting untouched each morning, when Oliver checked on it from a careful distance. Daniel found himself standing outside the guest room more often now, sometimes for a half hour at a time, simply listening, trying to understand a creature that refused to be understood. "You're going to have to make a decision soon," Oliver told him one afternoon, standing in the study with his cap in his hands, the way he always did when he had something difficult to say. "The staff is scared, sir. Not scared of losing their jobs, scared of the dog itself. I've been doing this work a long time, and I've never seen an animal act the way this one does. He's either going to hurt someone, or he's going to hurt himself, and either way, I don't think staying in that room by himself is doing him any good." "What would you have me do?" Daniel asked, more sharply than he intended. Oliver hesitated. "There's a specialized facility, 2 counties over. They handle dogs that have been through severe trauma, dogs that ordinary households can't manage. I know it's not what your brother would have wanted to hear, sir, but I think it might be the safest option for everyone, including the dog." Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought of the letter again, the handwriting he knew so well, the plea buried in a single sentence that had somehow become the heaviest weight in his house since the funeral. He thought of Bruno's whimper through the door, quiet and broken, nothing like the aggressive lunge Victor had encountered on his first visit. 2 very different animals seemed to live inside that room, and Daniel could not decide which one was closer to the truth. "Give me 2 more weeks," Daniel said finally. "If nothing changes in 2 weeks, I'll consider it." Oliver nodded, though his expression made clear he doubted anything would be different by then. The new housekeeper started that following Monday. Her name, according to the folder the agency had sent over, was Elena Martinez, and her references described her as dependable, thorough, and unusually calm under pressure. Qualities Daniel found himself hoping were not simply polite language used to describe every candidate the agency sent his way. He met her himself at the front entrance that morning, something he rarely did with new staff, but the circumstances of the house no longer felt like anything ordinary applied. Elena was younger than he expected, perhaps in her early 30s, dressed plainly but neatly, her dark hair pulled back, her expression polite, but guarded, in the way people often looked when they were still sizing up a new employer. She carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder and nothing else. No assumptions, no expectations, just the quiet readiness of someone who had learned to walk into unfamiliar situations without complaint. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Daniel said, shaking her hand briefly. "Before you begin, there's something important I need to explain." He walked her through it as plainly as he could. The dog, the destroyed guest room, the trainer's warnings, the staff, who had refused to return. He watched her face carefully as he spoke. waiting for the same flicker of fear he had seen in every other candidate's eyes, the moment where the job suddenly seemed like far more trouble than it was worth. Instead, Elena listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "He's not eating well?" she asked, once Daniel had finished. The question caught him off guard. Every other person he had told this story to had asked about safety first, about locks, and distances and liability. Elena's first question was about the dog's appetite. "Not for the last 2 nights," Daniel said. "Frightened animals often stop eating," Elena said simply. "It's not unusual. My cousin used to work at an animal shelter back home. I used to help out sometimes, when I was younger. I saw a lot of dogs come in scared like that. I'd ask that you stay away from that part of the house entirely," Daniel said. "The East Wing is off limits. I don't want anyone else getting hurt trying to manage him." "Of course," Elena said. "I understand." She said it easily enough, and Daniel believed her, at least in that moment. He had no reason to think otherwise. She seemed sensible, careful, exactly the kind of steady presence the house needed, after weeks of chaos and staff turnover. He walked her through the rest of her duties, the kitchen, the main living areas, the guest rooms on the west side of the house that remained untouched by the disaster unfolding on the opposite end of the building. For the first few days, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Elena worked quietly and efficiently, keeping to herself, avoiding the East Wing entirely as instructed. Margaret mentioned once at dinner that the new girl seemed like a good hire, quiet but hard-working, the kind of person who did her job without needing to be told twice. Daniel, for his part, spent those same days wrestling with the decision looming over him. 2 weeks, he had told Oliver, though the number felt increasingly arbitrary the closer it drew near. He called Victor once more, hoping for some new suggestion, some technique not yet attempted, but the trainer's tone on the phone was gentle and final, in a way that left little room for hope. "I've thought about it more since my last visit," Victor said. "And I want to be honest with you, Mr. Reyes, because I think you deserve honesty, rather than false comfort. Some dogs can be reached with enough time and the right approach. But I'm genuinely not certain this one can, at least not by conventional methods. Whatever happened to him before your brother found him, it left a mark deeper than I usually see. I don't say this to discourage you, only to prepare you for the possibility that this may not have the outcome you're hoping for." Daniel thanked him and hung up, sitting in his study long after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular. Outside, the evening light faded slowly across the grounds, and somewhere in the East Wing, behind a closed door, a dog, that no one seemed able to reach, sat alone with whatever memories haunted him. It was on the 5th day of Elena's employment that everything began to change, though nothing about that particular afternoon suggested it at the time. She had finished her assigned duties earlier than usual, and found herself with a small window of free time before she needed to collect her son from school. Margaret had gone to run an errand in town. Oliver was occupied with the grounds on the far side of the property. The house, for a brief stretch of the afternoon, was quieter than it had been in weeks. Elena moved down the hallway toward the supply closet near the East Wing to retrieve extra cleaning cloths, following the general layout Margaret had shown her on her first day. She had no intention of going anywhere near the guest room. She simply needed to pass close enough to reach the closet door. That was when she heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, broken whimper coming from behind the closed door at the end of the hallway, the same door Daniel had warned her never to approach. Elena paused, her hand still resting on the closet handle, listening. It did not sound like the growling, snarling animal Daniel had described. It sounded, instead, like something small and frightened, something that had simply given up hoping anyone would come. She knew she had been told to stay away. She knew the instructions had been clear, repeated more than once, meant to protect her from exactly the kind of danger Daniel and the others believed waited behind that door. But something in the sound stopped her from walking away, some quiet certainty she could not entirely explain, even to herself. She had grown up around frightened animals long before she ever set foot in this house, and she recognized something in that whimper that no one else in this household, for all their caution, seemed to have noticed yet. It was not the sound of a dangerous animal. It was the sound of a very frightened one. Elena stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hand still resting against the closet door, listening to the soft, broken sound coming from behind the guest room at the far end of the corridor. Every instinct that came from years of caution told her to walk away, to gather her cleaning supplies and return to the parts of the house where she was welcome. But another instinct, older and quieter, kept her feet planted exactly where they were. She thought of her son, Leo, 6 years old, and waiting for her at the end of the school day, and how she had promised herself when she took this job that she would follow every rule exactly as given. No exceptions, no risks, nothing that could cost her the steady income her small family depended on. She had been without steady work for nearly 4 months before this position came through, and she knew better than most how quickly a single mistake could unravel everything she had carefully rebuilt. And yet, the whimper came again, softer this time, almost resigned, and Elena felt something in her chest tighten in response. She had spent countless afternoons as a teenager sitting in the back room of her cousin's animal shelter, holding dogs no one else wanted to approach. Dogs labeled aggressive or unpredictable by people who had given up trying to understand them. She remembered one dog in particular, a shepherd mix named Duke, who had snapped at every volunteer who tried to leash him, until the day someone finally stopped trying to leash him at all and simply sat down on the floor of his kennel instead, saying nothing, asking for nothing. Duke had come around within 2 weeks. Not through training, not through force, through nothing more complicated than patience and stillness, given freely, without expectation of anything in return. Elena set down the empty basket she had been carrying and walked slowly toward the guest room door, her steps quiet against the hardwood floor. She stopped just outside, listening once more, and heard the whimper fade into a low, uncertain growl the moment her footsteps must have become audible on the other side. She should have turned back then. She knew it, even as her hand reached for the door handle instead. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, meant more for herself than for whatever was waiting on the other side of the door. "I'm just going to sit down for a minute, that's all." She opened the door slowly, only wide enough to slip inside, and closed it gently behind her. The room looked worse than Daniel had described. Broken furniture pushed into uneven piles along the walls, deep scratches gouged into the wooden floor near the window, the curtains reduced to little more than tattered strips hanging from a bent rod, and in the far corner, pressed against the wall as though trying to disappear into it entirely, sat the dog. He was larger than Elena had imagined, his coat matted and dull, his ribs faintly visible beneath patches of thinning fur. His eyes, though, were what caught her attention most, wide and dark and fixed on her, with an intensity that held more fear than aggression, despite the low growl still rumbling from somewhere deep in his throat. Elena did not move toward him. She did not speak again, not yet. Instead, she lowered herself carefully to the floor, several feet from the door, keeping her body angled slightly away from him rather than facing him directly, the way she remembered doing with Duke all those years ago. She folded her legs beneath her, rested her hands quietly in her lap, and simply sat. The growling continued for several long minutes, though it seemed to lose some of its intensity the longer Elena remained still. She did not look directly at him. She kept her gaze lowered toward the floor between them, her breathing slow and even, her posture as unthreatening as she could manage. Time passed slowly in that room. Elena had no way of knowing exactly how long she sat there, only that her legs had begun to ache slightly against the hard floor by the time the growling finally quieted into silence. She glanced up carefully, just enough to see that Bruno had lowered himself slightly, his body no longer pressed quite so tightly against the corner, though his eyes remained fixed on her, alert and uncertain. "You've had a hard time," Elena said softly, keeping her voice low and even. "I understand. You don't have to trust me. I'm not asking you to." Bruno's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, though he did not move otherwise. Elena continued speaking in the same quiet tone, saying nothing of particular importance, simply letting the sound of a calm human voice fill the space between them, the way she remembered doing with frightened animals, long before she ever imagined working in a house like this one. She stayed for nearly 20 minutes before finally rising slowly to her feet, careful to keep her movements gradual and predictable. Bruno tensed again as she stood, a low growl returning briefly to his throat, but he did not lunge, did not bark, did not do anything beyond watching her with the same wary intensity that had marked the entire encounter. "I have to go now," Elena said quietly, "but I'll come back." She left the room the way she had entered it, slow and careful, closing the door gently behind her. Standing in the empty hallway afterward, her heart still beating faster than usual, she found herself smiling faintly, despite everything she had been told about the danger waiting behind that door. She had not been foolish, she told herself. She had recognized something the others had missed, something buried beneath the surface of a dog everyone assumed was simply broken beyond repair. Whatever had happened to him before he arrived at this house, whatever cruelty had shaped the animal Daniel described to her on her first day, it had left behind fear, not malice. And fear, Elena knew from long experience, could be answered with patience, in a way that anger and force never could. She gathered her cleaning supplies from where she had left them, and returned to her regular duties, saying nothing to anyone about what had just occurred. She told herself it was a private matter, something she had done on instinct rather than instruction, and that speaking of it might only bring trouble she could not afford. But as she moved through the rest of her afternoon, folding linens, dusting shelves in the West Wing, collecting her son from school later that day, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the dog sitting alone in that ruined room, and the quiet stillness that had settled over him by the time she left. She thought of Leo, waiting for her outside the school gates, his small backpack slung over one shoulder, his face lighting up the moment he spotted her among the other parents. She thought of how much she had sacrificed already, to keep a roof over their heads and food on their table, how carefully she guarded every decision that might put that stability at risk. And yet, walking home that evening with Leo's hand in hers, she found herself thinking not of the risk she had taken, but of the dog's eyes finally softening, if only slightly, by the time she had risen to leave. The following morning, Elena arrived at the estate earlier than required, her mind made up before she had even stepped through the front gate. She completed her regular duties with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all week, careful not to draw attention to herself, careful to appear as though nothing about her routine had changed. But when her afternoon window of free time arrived once more, she found herself walking again toward the East Wing, toward the closed door at the end of the hallway, her steps quieter this time, more deliberate. She did not know, as she reached for the door handle a second time, that Daniel Reyes had returned from a meeting in town earlier than expected that day, and was, at that very moment, walking down a different hallway toward his study, close enough that the sound of a door opening in the East Wing would not go unnoticed for long. Nor did she know that this second visit would be far harder to keep hidden than the first. Elena opened the door slowly, the same careful motion she had used the day before, and slipped inside, before closing it behind her with a quiet click. The room looked exactly as she had left it, the broken furniture still scattered along the walls, the torn curtains still hanging limp from their bent rod. Bruno was in the same corner as before, though this time his eyes found her the moment the door opened, watching her with something that looked less like fear, and more like careful attention. She did not approach him. She lowered herself to the floor, at the same distance as the previous day, folding her legs beneath her, resting her hands quietly in her lap. The growl that greeted her this time was softer than before, shorter, almost hesitant, as though some part of him recognized the pattern already forming between them. "Hello again?" Elena said softly. "I told you I would come back." Bruno's ears shifted slightly at the sound of her voice, though his body remained tense, coiled tightly in the corner. Elena kept her gaze low, her posture relaxed, and allowed the silence to stretch comfortably between them, broken only by the occasional soft word she offered, nothing demanding, nothing that required a response. She had been sitting there perhaps 10 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching down the hallway outside, unhurried but distinct, growing louder. As they neared the guest room door, Elena's heart quickened, though she kept her body still, unwilling to startle Bruno by moving suddenly. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a pause, long enough that Elena wondered if whoever stood outside might simply continue past without entering. Then the handle turned, and the door opened. Daniel Reyes stood in the doorway, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as he took in the scene before him. The housekeeper he had explicitly warned to stay away from this room, sitting calmly on the floor, only a few feet from the dog, every trainer and staff member had described as too dangerous to approach. "What are you doing?" Daniel's voice came out sharper than he intended, though he kept it low, some instinct warning him against raising it further in a room already charged with tension. Bruno's body tensed instantly at the sudden appearance of a second person, a low growl building in his throat once more, his eyes darting between Daniel in the doorway and Elena still seated calmly on the floor. Please, Elena said quietly, not turning to face him directly. Please close the door slowly. Don't make any sudden movements. Daniel hesitated, every instinct telling him to pull her out of that room immediately, but something in her steady tone made him pause. He stepped back slightly and eased the door mostly closed, leaving only a narrow gap, watching through it as Bruno's growl gradually softened again, his attention returning to Elena rather than the door. I told you the East Wing was off limits, Daniel said, quieter now, though the frustration in his voice remained clear. That dog has already frightened away trainers with years of experience. What were you thinking? I heard him crying yesterday, Elena said, still not turning around, her voice calm and even, despite the tension in the room. It didn't sound like an aggressive animal, Mr. Reyes. It sounded like a frightened one. There's a difference, if you know what to listen for. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, watching through the narrow gap in the doorway as Bruno's rigid posture slowly began to ease, his body lowering slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Elena with careful, wary attention. He hasn't attacked you, Daniel said slowly, almost to himself, disbelief coloring his voice. No, Elena said, he hasn't, and I don't think he will, not if we're patient with him. He's not looking for a fight. He's looking for someone to prove they won't hurt him. Daniel stood in the doorway a while longer, watching the strange, quiet scene unfolding before him. A scene entirely unlike anything he had witnessed in the weeks since Bruno's arrival. No lunging, no snapping. Just a dog and a woman sitting several feet apart, one still tense with uncertainty, the other utterly calm, as though nothing about the situation frightened her at all. You could have been hurt, Daniel said finally, though the sharp edge had left his voice, replaced by something closer to genuine concern. I gave you clear instructions to stay away from this room. I know, Elena said, and I understand, if that means trouble for me, but I couldn't just walk past and pretend I didn't hear him, not when I thought I might be able to help. Daniel studied her for a long moment through the narrow gap in the door, taking in the steady set of her shoulders, the calm patience in her voice, so different from the frightened caution every other member of his staff had shown around this room. He thought of Victor's final assessment, delivered with such professional certainty just days earlier, that some dogs simply could not be reached. And yet here was proof, however small, however uncertain, that something in Bruno had responded to this woman, in a way he had not responded to anyone else. How long have you been coming in here? Daniel asked. This is only the second time, Elena said. Yesterday, and today. And both times, he's done this. Calm down, instead of... Daniel gestured vaguely toward the destroyed furniture scattered around the room. He was tense yesterday too, at first, Elena said, but he settled, eventually. I don't rush him, I just sit, and let him decide when he's ready to trust that I mean no harm. Daniel fell silent again, watching as Bruno shifted slightly in his corner, lowering his head just enough that his chin nearly touched his front paws, his eyes still open, still watchful, but noticeably less rigid than they had been only minutes before. I should let you finish, Daniel said finally, stepping back further from the doorway. I'll speak with you afterward. Please, be careful. I will, Elena said. Daniel closed the door the rest of the way, leaving Elena alone with Bruno once more, and stood in the hallway for a long moment afterward, processing what he had just witnessed. He thought of the weeks of failed attempts, the trainer's warnings, the staff who had refused to return, and the quiet, unremarkable scene he had just interrupted. A woman sitting calmly on the floor of a room everyone else considered too dangerous to enter. He did not fully understand what he had just seen, but some cautious, uncertain part of him began to wonder, for the first time since his brother's funeral, whether his brother's plea in that final letter might not have been quite as impossible to fulfill as he had feared. Inside the room, Elena remained seated a while longer, her voice low and steady, as she continued speaking softly to the dog still watching her from across the space between them. She told him about nothing in particular, the weather outside, the quiet routines of the house, the sound of birds she had heard earlier that morning near the garden. None of it mattered in its content. What mattered, she knew from years of experience, was simply the steady, unthreatening presence of her voice, filling the space where fear had lived alone for far too long. When she finally rose to leave, nearly half an hour after Daniel had interrupted them, she noticed something she had not seen during her first visit the day before. Bruno had shifted position slightly while she sat with him, moving perhaps a foot closer than where he had started, close enough that the distance between them had noticeably shrunk, though he still remained several feet away. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who had not been watching as carefully as she had, but to Elena, it felt like the first real sign that something in this frightened, wounded animal had begun, however slowly, to soften. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her, and found Daniel waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. Elena nodded, following him toward his study, uncertain whether the conversation waiting for her there would end with a warning, a dismissal, or something else entirely. But whatever came next, she found she did not regret the choice she had made. Whatever the cost to her own position in this house, she had seen something in that room worth the risk, a flicker of calm, in an animal everyone else had already given up trying to reach. And she intended to see where that flicker might lead, if given the chance to continue. Daniel's study smelled faintly of old books and the coffee he had left cooling on his desk since that morning. He gestured for Elena to sit, though he remained standing himself, pacing slowly behind his desk as he tried to organize the questions crowding his thoughts. "I want to understand what just happened," he said finally, stopping to face her directly. "You walked into a room that every trained professional I've hired has refused to enter, without extreme caution, and you sat down on the floor, as though it were nothing at all. I need to know why you thought that was safe." "I didn't think it was entirely safe," Elena admitted. "But I didn't think it was as dangerous as everyone assumed either. There's a difference between an aggressive dog and a terrified one, Mr. Reyes. They can look the same from a distance, growling, tense, unwilling to be approached. But the reasons behind that behavior are very different, and so is what helps them." "Where did you learn this?" Daniel asked. "Your file from the agency mentions nothing about animal training." "Because I'm not a trainer," Elena said. "My cousin ran a small animal shelter back home, the kind that took in strays nobody else wanted. I used to help out there as a teenager, mostly cleaning kennels and preparing food, but sometimes, when a dog came in too frightened for anyone else to handle, my cousin would ask me to just sit with them. I was small, and quiet, and patient, in a way some of the older volunteers weren't. It wasn't a method anyone taught me formally. It was just something I learned by watching, and by doing it myself, over and over, with dog after dog." Daniel sat down slowly across from her, his earlier frustration fading into something closer to curiosity. "And it worked? Every time?" "Not every time," Elena said honestly. "Some dogs needed more than I could offer. Some needed real medical care, or time with someone more experienced than I was. But more often than I expected, it worked simply because no one had tried it before. Everyone assumed a frightened, defensive dog needed correction, or control, or careful handling with equipment and technique. Sometimes what they actually needed was just someone willing to sit quietly nearby, without demanding anything, until they realized on their own that they weren't in danger." Daniel thought of Victor's leash, his confident stride toward the guest room door, and the growl that had sent him stumbling backward within seconds. He thought of his own attempts, standing frozen in doorways, listening through closed doors at night, never once considering that the solution might be something as simple, and as difficult, as complete stillness. "You could have been hurt today," Daniel said again, though the words carried less weight now than they had in the hallway. "I understand the risk," Elena said, "and I understand if you feel you can't allow me to continue, given what could have happened. But I saw something in that room today that I don't think anyone else has seen since he arrived here." He calmed down, Mr. Reyes. "He moved closer to me by the time I left, just slightly, but he did. That's not something a truly dangerous animal does. That's something a frightened one does, when he starts to believe, even a little, that the person in front of him means him no harm." Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, weighing everything she had said against everything he had witnessed over the past several weeks. The failed attempts, the mounting warnings, the growing sense that Bruno might simply be beyond anyone's ability to reach. "If I allow this to continue," Daniel said slowly, "I need to know you understand the risk you're taking, and that you won't push him faster than he's ready for. I've already lost most of my staff to fear of that room. I don't want to lose you to something worse." "I understand," Elena said. "I won't rush him. That's not how this works anyway. If anything, rushing him would undo whatever progress we make." Daniel studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt, that might suggest she was simply telling him what she thought he wanted to hear. He found none, only the same steady calm she had shown in the guest room only half an hour earlier. 20 minutes, Daniel said finally. That's what I'll allow. Once a day. And only when someone else is in the house, in case something goes wrong. I want the door left unlocked, and I want to be informed every time you go in, without exception. That's fair, Elena said. And Elena, Daniel added, as she rose to leave, thank you, for noticing something the rest of us missed. She nodded, offering a small, uncertain smile before leaving the study, and Daniel remained behind for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, turning over everything he had just witnessed and agreed to. It felt reckless, allowing a member of his staff to sit unprotected in a room with a dog that had already destroyed nearly every piece of furniture inside it. And yet something about the quiet certainty in Elena's voice and the small, undeniable shift he had witnessed in Bruno's posture through that narrow gap in the doorway kept him from second-guessing the decision entirely. Over the following days, Elena's visits became a quiet, steady routine, tucked carefully into the edges of her regular duties. Each afternoon, once her assigned work was finished, she would make her way to the East Wing, informing Daniel, or whoever happened to be nearby, before slipping into the guest room and settling onto the floor, at the same careful distance from Bruno. She brought nothing with her at first, no treats, no toys, nothing that might suggest an attempt to coax him closer before he was ready. She simply sat, spoke softly when the silence stretched too long, and allowed Bruno to grow accustomed to her presence at his own pace, exactly as she had done with every frightened animal she had encountered years before. The growling that had greeted her during those first 2 visits faded steadily with each passing day. By the end of the first week, Bruno no longer tensed the moment the door opened, though he remained watchful, his eyes tracking her every movement as she settled onto the floor across from him. He had begun, too, to move slightly closer during each visit, a few inches at a time, narrowing the distance between them bit by bit, though he still stopped well short of anything resembling direct contact. Word of Elena's visits inevitably spread through the household staff, despite her efforts to keep the routine as quiet as possible. Margaret mentioned it hesitantly at dinner one evening, her tone equal parts concern and disbelief. "She's really going in there every day?" Margaret asked. "Alone, with that dog?" "She is," Daniel confirmed. "And so far, nothing's happened. If anything, he seems calmer than he's been since he arrived." "I still don't understand it," Margaret admitted. "Victor couldn't get within 10 feet of that animal without him lunging, and she just walks in and sits down like it's nothing at all." Daniel found himself without a clear explanation, though he had begun watching Elena's visits more closely himself, standing quietly in the hallway, with the door left slightly ajar, observing the strange, patient ritual unfolding inside. He noticed things he had missed before, the careful angle of Elena's shoulders, always turned slightly away from Bruno rather than facing him head-on, the low, even tone of her voice, never rising, never demanding, simply present. He began to understand, slowly, that what she was doing was not simply sitting quietly and waiting. It was a deliberate, careful language, one built entirely around patience and stillness, one that asked nothing of Bruno beyond his own willingness to exist in the same space as another creature without fear. It was on the 8th day of Elena's visits that something shifted, in a way even she had not fully expected. She had settled onto the floor as usual, speaking softly about nothing in particular, when Bruno, instead of remaining in his usual spot along the far wall, rose slowly to his feet and took several careful steps toward her, close enough that Elena could hear the soft sound of his breathing for the first time since she had begun these visits. She did not move. She did not reach toward him, or shift her position, or do anything that might interrupt whatever fragile courage had brought him this far. She simply continued speaking in the same low, steady voice, allowing him to close the remaining distance entirely on his own terms. Bruno stopped just short of her, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him, though she kept her hands still in her lap, waiting. His eyes, still wary, still uncertain, held hers for a long, quiet moment, before he lowered himself slowly to the floor, close enough that his front paws nearly touched the edge of her folded legs. It was not contact, not yet, but it was closer than he had come in all the days before, and Elena felt something in her chest tighten with a quiet, careful hope she had not allowed herself to fully feel until that moment. Outside in the hallway, unseen through the narrow gap in the door, Daniel Reyes stood watching, and felt, for the first time since his brother's funeral, that perhaps his brother's final wish was not so impossible to fulfill after all. Daniel did not tell Elena he had watched that moment from the hallway. He stood frozen behind the narrow gap in the door, long after Bruno had settled onto the floor near her folded legs, watching the two of them remain there together in silence, neither moving, neither needing to. When Elena finally rose to leave nearly 10 minutes later, Daniel stepped quickly and quietly back down the hallway, unwilling to let her know he had witnessed something that felt, somehow, too private to acknowledge openly. That night, he found himself returning to the East Wing long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, standing outside the guest room door the way he had so many nights before. But this time, when he pressed his ear gently against the wood, he heard no whimpering, no restless pacing, no sound at all beyond the soft, steady breathing of an animal finally at rest. He thought of his brother again, the letters Patrick used to send describing his work at the rescue center, always filled with the same quiet patience Elena seemed to carry so naturally. Patrick had never rushed the animals in his care. He had written once, years earlier, about a fox with a badly injured leg that had taken nearly 3 months before it would allow him within arm's reach, and how the eventual trust it offered had felt like one of the proudest achievements of his life. Daniel had not understood that pride at the time. Now, standing outside a quiet door where a dog everyone else had given up on finally slept in peace, he began to understand it more fully than he ever had before. The following morning, Daniel found himself lingering near the kitchen earlier than usual, watching Elena move through her regular duties with the same quiet efficiency she always showed. He had questions he wanted to ask her, though he found himself hesitant to voice them, uncertain exactly what he hoped to learn, or why the answer suddenly mattered to him as much as it did. "How did you know he was ready to come closer?" Daniel asked finally, catching her alone in the hallway as she carried a stack of folded linens toward the guest rooms on the west side of the house. Elena paused, considering the question carefully before answering. "I didn't know, exactly. I just kept doing what I'd been doing, and paid attention to small changes. The way he held his ears, how long it took him to settle after I sat down, whether his breathing slowed or stayed tense. Little things most people wouldn't notice, but they add up, over time, into a clearer picture of what an animal is ready for. And yesterday, you could tell he was ready?" "I could tell he wanted to try," Elena said. "There's a difference between an animal being ready and an animal being brave enough to attempt something before he's fully ready. Sometimes the second happens first, and you have to let it, carefully, without pushing, and see what follows." Daniel nodded slowly, turning the explanation over in his mind. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Elena said, a faint smile touching her expression for the first time since she had begun working in the house. "It just looks simple from the outside. Underneath, it's mostly patience, and paying very close attention to things that seem too small to matter." Over the days that followed, Daniel found himself drawn increasingly toward the East Wing during Elena's afternoon visits, no longer content to observe from a careful distance through the narrow gap in the doorway. He began asking, tentatively at first, whether he might sit nearby, well away from Bruno, simply to watch and learn. Elena agreed, though she cautioned him carefully before his first attempt. "Stay low," she told him. "Don't look at him directly for too long. And whatever happens, don't react suddenly, even if he growls, even if he seems tense. Reacting is what tells him you're afraid, and fear from us only feeds his own." Daniel followed her instructions as best he could, lowering himself carefully near the doorway on his first visit, keeping several feet of distance between himself and where Elena sat closer to Bruno's corner. The dog's eyes flicked toward him immediately, wary and uncertain, a low growl rising briefly in his throat at this unfamiliar addition to the pattern he had grown accustomed to. "It's all right," Elena said softly, her voice calm and even, directed as much toward Daniel as toward Bruno. "Just stay still. Let him look. He's allowed to be uncertain." Daniel remained motionless, his heart beating faster than he expected, watching as Bruno's growl gradually faded, his attention shifting back toward Elena, though his eyes continued flicking toward Daniel every so often, cautious and watchful. It took nearly a week of these shared visits before Bruno stopped reacting entirely to Daniel's quiet presence near the doorway. By the second week, Daniel found himself sitting closer, though still well behind Elena, learning to read the same small signals she had described, the position of Bruno's ears, the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle shifts in his posture that told a story far more detailed than any growl or lunge ever could. "You're a natural at this," Elena told him one afternoon, after Daniel successfully predicted, correctly, that Bruno was growing restless, before the dog himself gave any obvious sign of it. "I had a good teacher," Daniel said, and meant it more than he expected to. Their conversations, once limited strictly to instructions about Bruno's care, began to expand naturally during these shared afternoons, filling the quiet stretches of time while they waited together for the dog to settle. Daniel learned, slowly and without ever directly asking, that Elena had a young son named Leo, that she had been raising him largely on her own for the past 2 years, and that steady work had been difficult to find since her previous employer's household had downsized unexpectedly, leaving her without income for several difficult months before the agency finally placed her here. Elena, in turn, learned pieces of Daniel's own story, fragments offered carefully at first, then more freely as the days passed. She learned about his brother, about the rescue center 2 hours north, about the letter that had convinced Daniel to bring Bruno into his home, rather than allow him to be placed in a shelter that might not have shown him the same patience Patrick always had. "He would be glad to see this," Elena said one afternoon, watching as Bruno, now noticeably more relaxed, rested his chin briefly against his own front paws, while keeping half an eye on both of them from across the room. "Your brother, I mean. Whatever he saw in this dog, I think it's still there. It just needed someone willing to wait long enough to find it." Daniel said nothing for a long moment, watching Bruno's slow, steady breathing, thinking of his brother's final letter, the single sentence that had haunted him since the funeral finally beginning to feel less like an impossible burden, and more like a promise, slowly being fulfilled. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on him, even when I nearly did." Elena glanced toward him, her expression soft. "I think you were closer to not giving up than you realize, Mr. Reyes. You kept him here, even after every trainer told you it might be hopeless. That's not nothing." "Daniel," he said. "Please, just Daniel." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Daniel." The name settled comfortably between them, marking, in some quiet, unspoken way, a shift in whatever careful boundary had existed between employer and employee since her first day in this house. Neither of them acknowledged it directly, though both, in their own way, felt its presence settle gently into the routine, growing steadily between them, built one patient afternoon at a time, alongside a dog slowly learning, at last, that safety was possible after all. 3 weeks after Elena's first quiet visit to the guest room, the household had settled into a rhythm no one could have predicted only a month earlier. Margaret no longer hesitated when asked to prepare food for delivery near the East Wing. Oliver, though still cautious, had stopped suggesting the specialized facility 2 counties over, watching instead with quiet astonishment as the dog he once considered a danger to everyone around him grew calmer with each passing week. Bruno had begun eating consistently again, his appetite returning, along with a healthier weight that filled out the gaunt lines of his frame. His coat, once dull and matted, had started to regain some of its natural shine, thanks in part to gentle brushing sessions Elena had slowly introduced, once he seemed ready for that level of contact. The destroyed furniture had long since been cleared away and replaced, though neither Daniel nor Elena had rushed that change, waiting until Bruno's behavior made clear that the room no longer needed to serve as a battleground against his own fear. It was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, during one of their now regular shared visits, that the moment both of them had been patiently waiting for finally arrived. Elena had settled onto the floor in her usual spot, and Daniel had taken his place a short distance behind her, close enough now that Bruno rarely reacted to his presence at all. The dog lay stretched across the floor near the center of the room, more relaxed than either of them had ever seen him, his breathing slow and even, his eyes half closed in the warm afternoon light, filtering through the newly repaired window. Elena had been speaking softly, as she always did, recounting some small detail about her morning, when Bruno rose slowly to his feet and crossed the remaining distance between them without hesitation, closing the gap he had spent weeks narrowing one cautious step at a time. He did not stop where he had stopped before. He continued forward until he stood directly beside her, and then, in a motion that seemed to surprise even himself, lowered his head gently into her lap, resting it there with a soft, contented sigh that carried none of the tension that had defined every moment of his presence in that house until now. Elena went very still, her breath catching slightly in her throat, though she resisted every instinct to move suddenly or make too much of the moment. Slowly, carefully, she lifted one hand and rested it gently against the side of Bruno's head, feeling him lean slightly into the touch rather than pull away from it. Behind her, Daniel felt something in his chest tighten unexpectedly, watching the scene unfold in complete silence. It was the first time since Bruno's arrival that the dog had voluntarily initiated contact with anyone, the first true sign that the trust Elena had worked so patiently to build had finally taken root, deeply enough for Bruno to offer it freely, without prompting, without hesitation born of desperation. "There you are," Elena whispered softly, her fingers moving in slow, gentle strokes along Bruno's fur. "I knew you were in there." Daniel remained motionless, unwilling to disturb the fragile, quiet moment unfolding before him, though his eyes had grown unexpectedly bright, blinking rapidly against an emotion he had not expected to feel so strongly. He thought of his brother again, of the countless afternoons Patrick must have spent in similarly quiet rooms with similarly frightened animals, patiently waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. He thought, too, of the woman sitting only a few feet away from him, who had walked into this house as a stranger only weeks earlier, and had somehow accomplished in a matter of days what trained professionals with years of experience had declared impossible. Bruno remained in that position for nearly 10 minutes, his breathing slow and steady, his body utterly relaxed against Elena's lap, in a way that would have seemed unimaginable only a month before. When he finally lifted his head again, it was not out of renewed wariness, but simple contentment, shifting position slightly, before settling down beside her instead, close enough now that his side pressed gently against her leg. "He trusts you," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "He trusts both of us now, I think," Elena said, glancing back toward him with a soft smile. "You've been coming to these sessions for weeks. He's grown used to you too, even if it happened more quietly." Daniel shook his head slightly, though he did not argue the point directly. Whatever role he had played in these recent weeks felt small compared to what he had just witnessed, the culmination of patient, careful work that belonged, in his mind, almost entirely to the woman sitting calmly on the floor beside him. "I don't know how to thank you properly for this," Daniel said. "You've done something here that I genuinely didn't believe was possible anymore." "You don't need to thank me," Elena said. "I didn't do this expecting anything in return. I just couldn't walk past a frightened animal and pretend I hadn't heard him. Still," Daniel said, "what you've given him, and honestly, what you've given this entire house, that's not something easily repaid." Elena said nothing further, though a faint color rose in her cheeks at the sincerity in his voice, and she returned her attention to Bruno, who had begun to doze lightly against her leg, his earlier tension replaced entirely by the deep, peaceful rest of an animal, finally at ease in his surroundings. News of Bruno's breakthrough spread quickly through the household over the following days. Margaret, upon hearing the story from Daniel himself, insisted on preparing a special meal that evening, something she had wanted to do for weeks, but had held back out of lingering caution. Oliver, stopping by the guest room later that same afternoon, under the careful supervision of both Elena and Daniel, watched in visible amazement as Bruno approached the doorway calmly, sniffing curiously at the unfamiliar visitor, without any trace of the aggression that had defined their previous encounters. "I owe you an apology," Oliver told Elena later that week, removing his cap the way he always did when he had something important to say. "I was certain that dog was beyond help. I've worked with animals my whole life, and I would have sworn on anything you asked that this situation could only end badly. I'm glad to have been wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong," Elena said kindly. "He was dangerous, in a way, when he first arrived. Fear like that can make any animal dangerous, if no one takes the time to understand where it's coming from." Victor, informed of the progress during a follow-up call Daniel placed out of professional courtesy, expressed genuine surprise, asking several detailed questions about the specific methods Elena had used, questions Daniel did his best to answer based on everything he had observed during their shared afternoons in the guest room. "I've been doing this work for 20 years, Victor admitted over the phone. "And I'll be honest with you, Mr. Reyes, I don't fully understand how she accomplished what she did in a matter of weeks. Sometimes, I suppose, the right approach has less to do with technique, and more to do with simple, patient kindness that most of us forget to offer when we're focused too heavily on results. Daniel thanked him for his honesty and ended the call, standing afterward in his study for a long while, reflecting on everything that had changed since that first chaotic day when Bruno arrived, wild and terrified, destroying the room around him within hours of his arrival. He thought of his brother's letter once more, the words he had read so many times since the funeral that he now knew them by heart. Don't give up on him too fast. Standing there, thinking of Bruno resting peacefully beside Elena, only a short distance away, Daniel felt, for the first time since Patrick's death, that he had finally honored that request in full, though the credit belonged far more to the quiet, patient woman who had walked into his household as a stranger than it did to himself. What Daniel did not yet fully understand, standing alone in his study that evening, was that the same patience Elena had shown toward a frightened, wounded dog had already begun quietly working its way into his own heart, reshaping feelings he had not expected to experience again since losing his wife years earlier, feelings he was only just beginning to recognize for what they truly were. By the start of the second month, Bruno had become an entirely different animal from the terrified, destructive creature who had first arrived at the estate. He greeted Elena at the door of the guest room each afternoon, with a soft wag of his tail, sometimes trotting forward to meet her before she had even fully entered the room. He allowed Margaret to bring his food directly inside rather than leaving it outside the door, and had grown comfortable enough with Oliver's presence to accept a gentle scratch behind the ears during the groundskeeper's occasional visits. Daniel, too, had become a regular fixture in Bruno's daily routine, no longer confined to the careful distance he had maintained during those early shared sessions with Elena. Bruno greeted him now with the same easy familiarity he showed Elena, leaning into scratches, resting his head against Daniel's knee during quiet afternoons spent together in the newly refurnished guest room, which had gradually transformed from a battlefield of broken furniture into a comfortable space that finally deserved to be called Bruno's own. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, nearly 6 weeks after Elena's first visit, that a sudden summer storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds gathering rapidly over the estate before the first crack of thunder split the sky. Bruno, who had been resting comfortably near the window only moments earlier, jolted upright the instant the thunder sounded, his entire body going rigid with a fear neither Daniel nor Elena had seen in him since the earliest days of his recovery. He backed quickly into the corner of the room, the same corner he had once claimed as his only refuge, trembling visibly as another crack of thunder rolled across the darkening sky. "It's all right," Elena said quickly, though she remained seated, resisting the instinct to rush toward him. "It's just noise. It can't hurt you." Bruno did not seem to hear her, his eyes wide and wild in a way that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of that very first day, when Bruno had crouched in this same corner, growling at anyone who dared come near. Another burst of thunder sounded, closer this time, and Bruno let out a low, distressed whine, pressing himself as tightly as possible against the wall. "Should we leave him alone?" Daniel asked quietly, uncertain whether their presence might be making things worse. "No," Elena said, her voice calm, despite the tension evident in her posture. "Leaving him alone right now would be the worst thing we could do. He needs to know we're still here, that this fear doesn't change anything between us." She lowered herself slowly to the floor, exactly as she had during those very first sessions weeks earlier, keeping her distance, keeping her voice low, and even, despite the storm raging outside. "I'm right here," she said softly. "This will pass. You're safe." Bruno did not move toward her, not immediately, his body still trembling with each subsequent crack of thunder, but he did not lunge, or growl, or show any sign of the aggression that had once defined every frightened moment of his early days in this house. He simply remained pressed against the wall, watching Elena with wide, uncertain eyes, torn between old fear and newer, hard-won trust. Daniel lowered himself carefully as well, keeping his distance, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage despite his own growing concern. "We're not going anywhere," he added quietly. "Whatever happens outside, we're staying right here with you." The storm continued for nearly 40 minutes, thunder rolling steadily overhead, rain lashing hard against the newly repaired windows. Throughout it all, Elena and Daniel remained exactly where they were, speaking softly whenever the thunder grew loud enough to startle Bruno anew, offering nothing more than steady, calm presence in the face of a fear that had nothing to do with either of them. Slowly, gradually, as the storm began to weaken and the intervals between thunderclaps grew longer, Bruno's trembling eased. He shifted position once, then again, and finally, as a distant rumble sounded far softer than before, he crossed the room toward Elena on unsteady legs and pressed himself against her side, seeking the same comfort he had learned, over these past weeks, that she could offer. Elena wrapped one arm gently around him, feeling his body still trembling faintly, though the wild panic in his eyes had begun to fade into something closer to simple exhaustion. "There," she murmured. "You did so well. I'm proud of you." Daniel watched the scene with a quiet ache in his chest, understanding now, more clearly than ever, what true recovery actually looked like. It was not a straight line from fear to safety. It was setbacks like this one, moments where old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly, met each time with the same patient reassurance that had built Bruno's trust in the first place. By the time the storm passed entirely, Bruno had settled fully against Elena, his breathing slow and even once more, his earlier panic replaced by the deep, contented calm that had become so familiar over these past weeks. Daniel moved closer as well, resting a gentle hand against Bruno's back, and for a long, quiet moment, the three of them remained there together, unified by an understanding that needed no words to express. "He handled that better than I expected," Daniel said finally, once the last of the storm's rumbling had faded into distant silence. "A month ago, I don't think he would have let either of us anywhere near him during something like that." "He's come a long way," Elena agreed, her hand still resting gently against Bruno's fur. "But fear like his doesn't disappear entirely. It just becomes something he knows how to move through now, instead of something that controls him completely." Daniel considered her words carefully, thinking not only of Bruno's progress, but of his own grief, the fear and uncertainty that had gripped him since his brother's sudden death, the guilt he had carried over accepting Bruno into his home, without fully understanding what that decision would require of him. He wondered, watching Elena's steady, patient presence beside the recovering dog, whether the same lesson might apply just as easily to human hearts as it did to frightened animals. "You've taught this house more than you probably realize," Daniel said quietly. "Not just him. All of us." Elena glanced toward him, her expression softening at the sincerity in his voice. "I think you're giving me too much credit," she said. "I only showed up and sat down. Everything else, the patience, the willingness to keep trying even when it seemed hopeless, that credit belongs to you as much as anyone." Daniel said nothing further, though something in her words settled deeply into his chest, alongside feelings he had been quietly acknowledging to himself for weeks now, feelings that had nothing directly to do with Bruno's recovery at all, and everything to do with the quiet, steady woman who had walked so unexpectedly into both their lives. Outside, the storm clouds cleared slowly, giving way to soft evening sunlight that spilled gently through the window, illuminating the three of them together, on the floor of a room that had once been nothing but wreckage, and had since become something entirely different, a place of healing, patience, and the slow, careful building of trust between hearts that had all, in their own ways, been waiting to be reached. In the weeks that followed the storm, something quietly shifted in the rhythm of the household, something neither Daniel nor Elena spoke of directly, though both felt its presence growing steadily between them. Their afternoons in the guest room no longer felt like scheduled sessions dedicated solely to Bruno's care. They had become something else entirely, a shared space where conversation flowed easily, where silences felt comfortable rather than uncertain, where two people who had started as employer and employee had slowly become something closer to genuine friends. Daniel found himself looking forward to these afternoons more than he cared to admit, arranging his schedule around them whenever possible, finding excuses to remain in the house rather than attend to business matters that could easily wait. He told himself, at first, that his continued involvement was simply about Bruno's ongoing progress, ensuring the dog's recovery remained steady and consistent. But as the weeks passed, he could no longer convince himself that Bruno was the only reason he found himself drawn so consistently to that quiet room each afternoon. Elena, for her part, noticed the shift as well, though she kept her own feelings carefully guarded, uncertain what to make of the warmth that had steadily grown between herself and the man who remained, despite everything, her employer. She thought often of Leo, of the stability this position had finally given her small family after months of uncertainty, and worried, in her quieter moments, that whatever she felt developing toward Daniel might put that hard-won stability at risk if she allowed herself to acknowledge it too openly. It was Margaret, perceptive after years of watching households rise and fall around her, who first gently broached the subject one evening while helping Elena fold linens in the kitchen. "You've changed things around here," Margaret said, not looking up from her work. "Not just with the dog, with him too." Elena's hands paused briefly over the linen she had been folding. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Margaret said, though her tone remained kind rather than accusing. "I've worked in this house a long time, dear. I've seen Mr. Reyes go through more than his share of grief these past years. First his wife, now his brother. I haven't seen him smile the way he does lately. Not in a very long time. We're just friends," Elena said carefully. "I work for him, Margaret. That's all this can be." Margaret studied her for a long moment, her expression softening further. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said. "I only mention it because I think you should know, whatever you decide to do with it, that I don't believe I'm the only one who's noticed." Elena said nothing further, though Margaret's words lingered with her long after their conversation ended, following her home that evening as she walked hand in hand with Leo along the familiar path toward their small apartment. She thought of Daniel's quiet kindness, the way he had learned to sit patiently beside Bruno over these past weeks, the genuine warmth in his voice whenever he thanked her for something she had never expected recognition for in the first place. She thought too of the careful boundaries she had maintained throughout her working life, boundaries built specifically to protect herself and her son from the kind of complications that could unravel even the most stable situation without warning. The following afternoon, during their regular time together in the guest room, Daniel seemed unusually quiet, watching Bruno rest contentedly near the window rather than engaging in their usual easy conversation. Elena noticed the change immediately, though she said nothing at first, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them as it so often did. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said finally, breaking the quiet. "Of course," Elena said. "When you first came into this house," Daniel said slowly, "I imagine the last thing you expected was to become the reason everything changed here. Not just for Bruno. For all of us." Elena felt her heart quicken slightly at the direction of his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I only did what I knew how to do," she said. "I never expected anything beyond that." "I know," Daniel said. "That's part of what makes it remarkable. You didn't come here looking to change anything. You just noticed something the rest of us missed, and you were patient enough to see it through." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I find myself thinking about you more than I probably should, Elena. Not just as someone I'm grateful to for what you've done for Bruno. As someone whose company I've come to value, more than I expected to, given everything." Elena's breath caught slightly, uncertain how to respond, torn between the warmth spreading through her chest at his words and the careful caution she had maintained throughout her working life. "Daniel," she said slowly, "I appreciate you saying that, but I need to be honest with you. I can't afford complications in my life right now. This position matters too much to me, and to my son. I don't know if what you're describing is something real, or simply gratitude that's grown into something it isn't." Daniel considered her words seriously, nodding slowly, rather than rushing to argue against them. "That's a fair concern," he said. "I won't pretend it isn't. But I want you to know, whatever you decide, that my feelings aren't about gratitude alone. I've had weeks now to sit with this, to watch you with Bruno, to get to know you as more than just the person who saved him. What I feel has grown well past simple thankfulness, Elena. I understand if you need time to trust that. I'm not asking for anything beyond your honesty." Elena remained quiet for a long moment, watching Bruno shift comfortably near the window, thinking of everything that had brought her to this room, this house, this unexpected turn in a life she had worked so carefully to stabilize after so many difficult months. She thought of Leo, waiting for her each afternoon with his easy smile, and of the careful walls she had built around her heart since becoming a mother alone, walls meant to protect them both from disappointment. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Not because I don't feel something too. I think I do, and that frightens me more than I want to admit. But I need to be certain, for my son's sake as much as my own, before I let myself trust it fully." "Take whatever time you need," Daniel said gently. I'm not going anywhere. Neither is he. He nodded toward Bruno, who had lifted his head slightly at the sound of their voices, watching them both with the same calm, trusting eyes that had taken so many patient weeks to earn. Elena managed a small, genuine smile, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, despite the uncertainty still lingering in her chest. Whatever came next, she thought, watching Daniel settle back beside Bruno with the same gentle patience he had learned from her these past weeks. It would not be decided in haste, the same way nothing about Bruno's healing had ever been rushed. Some things, she had learned firsthand these past months, were worth taking the time to get right. 3 weeks passed after that quiet conversation in the guest room, weeks in which neither Daniel nor Elena spoke again directly of what had been said between them, though both carried the weight of it privately, turning it over in their thoughts during the quiet hours of each passing day. Their afternoons together continued as before, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silence, Bruno resting contentedly between them, now fully recovered into the gentle, trusting companion his early days in the house had given no indication he could ever become. Elena used that time carefully, weighing everything Margaret had said, everything Daniel had offered, against her own careful instincts built from years of protecting her small family from unnecessary risk. She spoke with her sister one evening over the phone, laying out the situation honestly, uncertain what advice she hoped to receive. "You've spent your whole life being careful," her sister said gently. "Maybe it's all right to let yourself want something too, just this once, instead of only thinking about what could go wrong." Elena thought of those words often in the days that followed, watching Leo play quietly in their small apartment each evening, thinking of the stability she had built so carefully for his sake, and wondering, cautiously, whether that stability might grow rather than shatter, if she allowed herself to trust what she felt developing toward Daniel. It was Leo himself, in his own unknowing way, who helped settle the question for her. Daniel had begun, over recent weeks, joining Elena occasionally when she collected her son from school, keeping a respectful distance at first, simply offering friendly conversation as the three of them walked partway home together. Leo, delighted by the novelty of a new adult presence in his routine, had taken to Daniel with the easy trust only children seem capable of offering freely, asking endless questions about Bruno, about the big house Daniel lived in, about whether he might someday be allowed to meet the now gentle dog his mother spoke of so often. "You really made him better?" Leo asked Daniel one afternoon, his small hand tucked into Elena's as they walked. "Even though he used to bite people?" "Your mother made him better," Daniel said, glancing warmly toward Elena. "I just watched and learned from her." Leo considered this seriously, the way children often consider matters of great importance. "She's good at making scared things feel safe," he said simply. "She does that for me too sometimes, when I'm scared of things." Elena felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at her son's words, spoken with such simple, unguarded honesty, and glanced toward Daniel to find him watching her with an expression of quiet tenderness that settled, finally, whatever lingering uncertainty had remained in her heart. That evening, after Leo had gone to bed, Elena found herself walking back toward the estate under the gathering dusk, having told Daniel earlier that day that she needed to speak with him once more, before the household settled for the night. She found him in the guest room, as she expected, sitting quietly beside Bruno, who lifted his head in greeting the moment she entered, his tail thumping gently against the floor. "I've thought about what you said," Elena began, settling onto the floor beside them both. "About your feelings, and about the time I asked for." Daniel waited, saying nothing, allowing her the space to continue at her own pace, the same patience he had learned so thoroughly from watching her work with Bruno these past months. "I was afraid," Elena admitted. "Not of you exactly. Of what it might mean to let myself want something more than stability, after working so hard to build the little bit of it I finally have. But I think, watching you these past weeks, watching how patient you've been, with Bruno, and with me, I think I've been afraid of the wrong thing entirely." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked gently. "I think I've spent so long guarding against disappointment that I nearly missed something real, simply because it frightened me to hope for it," Elena said. "My son told me today that I'm good at making scared things feel safe. I think, if I'm honest, I've forgotten how to let someone do that for me in return." Daniel reached carefully for her hand, the gesture soft and uncertain. mirroring in its own way the patient caution Elena had shown Bruno during those very first visits weeks earlier. Instead, she allowed her fingers to curl gently around his, feeling something settle warmly in her chest. The same quiet, steady sense of safety she had spent months carefully building for a frightened, wounded dog, now finally being offered back to her in return. "I'm not asking you to rush anything," Daniel said softly. "We can go as slowly as you need. I only wanted you to know that whatever I feel, it's real, and it isn't going anywhere." "I know," Elena said, a small smile finally breaking free across her face. "I think I've known for a while now. I just needed to be brave enough to admit it." Bruno, sensing the shift in the quiet room around him, rose slowly and moved between them, resting his head contentedly across both their laps, as though sealing, in his own simple way, the bond that had grown so unexpectedly from his own difficult beginning. In the months that followed, the household continued to change in small, steady ways that mirrored Bruno's own transformation. Elena remained employed at the estate, though her role gradually shifted as her relationship with Daniel deepened into something neither of them tried any longer to hide. Leo became a familiar, welcome presence in the house, his laughter often heard echoing down hallways that had once carried nothing but tension and fear. Bruno, fully recovered, grew into a gentle, loyal companion who followed Daniel and Elena through the grounds each morning, greeting Leo with the same soft affection he showed them both, utterly transformed from the terrified, destructive animal who had once destroyed an entire room within hours of his arrival. Margaret often remarked, watching the three of them together in the garden some mornings, that she had never imagined a single dog could bring so much unexpected change into one household. Oliver, who had once been so certain Bruno's presence signaled nothing but trouble, found himself instead grateful for the very warning signs he had misread so completely at first, understanding now that fear, whether in an animal or a person, so often simply needed the right kind of patience to be understood, rather than avoided. Daniel, standing in the garden one quiet evening with Elena beside him and Bruno resting peacefully at their feet, thought often of his brother's final letter, the words that had guided him through the most uncertain weeks of his grief. Don't give up on him too fast. He understood now, more fully than he ever could have imagined at the time, that his brother's plea had been about far more than simply saving a frightened dog. It had been, in its own quiet way, an invitation to trust again, to remain patient through fear and uncertainty, and to believe that even the most broken things, whether animal or heart, could find their way back to safety, given enough time, and enough love, and someone patient enough to simply sit quietly on the floor and wait.